Right now, people are not happy with Smash Ultimate's meta, largely because the meta incentivizes campy behavior. And that's not to say that defensive play is necessarily an issue. Defensive play is not necessarily camping, and defensive play can be interesting, unique, and expressive, and we should try to carve out a space for defensive play in our meta. However, people are still pretty unhappy with how the meta is going. Coney recently made a video where he actually correctly identified a lot of issues that exist in our current meta, but he just didn't have a great solution. He proposed adding stages to the already existing rule set that don't really have any business being in a competitive rule set, and would basically exist just to be banned always. I want to propose something different. Some people think that basically any rule set proposal is just people wanting things to be shaken up, and while those people definitely do exist, there are genuine problems within the meta that are caused by our stage list and our rule set. This is partly because the game just has more stages that incentivize non-interactive behavior. If we make a list of every possible legal stage in the game, most of them are going to allow for non-interactive behavior. And this compounds with the fact that it's more risky to approach than to wait for your opponent to approach. So getting a lead and waiting for your opponent to approach is more times optimal than not. And this is partly because the community has purposefully tried to avoid variety in order to curb polarization, which is a good idea. We don't want things to be too polarized. However, I think we've gone too far. The blast zones, the stage sizes, and the platform layouts are all very similar, so this makes choosing a stage much less consequential or interesting than something like Melee. In Melee, choosing a stage means something. It has a pretty big effect on how matchups play out. And while some of them are arguably too polarizing, it's still nice to have variety and choice when it comes to stages. And I think we can address these issues. This isn't just about shaking things up, it's about fixing issues with the rules that have always been there. The first rule change I want to propose is the Taunt Clause. If you can taunt 9 times in a row, uninterrupted, while on the ground, the opponent has to lose a stock. It takes 50 frames to taunt before you can buffer something else, so that's 7.5 seconds of taunting before someone has to lose a stock. We need to make sure that there's more than enough time to hit somebody while they're taunting, or else a camping opponent against a slow character could just taunt and make their opponent lose a stock. And then obviously your taunt count would reset when somebody dies or respawns. This is to avoid people hitting the opponent off stage, starting to taunt while the opponent has no ability to hit them, and then making the opponent lose a stock just for dying and respawning. The Taunt Clause is put in place to force a camping opponent to interact. Usually this will play out with a camping opponent being forced to enter the mid-range, and the taunter being forced to stop the taunt. This gives every character the ability to force an approach. Everyone has a waft charge, or limit, or mining. Obviously, this is a really powerful tool. It previously only belonged to some of the best characters in the game, so we use taunts because it forces the player into 50-frame increments where they can't do anything. You open yourself up to losing stage control or getting hit in exchange for forcing an approach. Now let's move on to my proposed stage list. As Coney argued, the current stage list is very monolithic. It's very big stages with very similar blast zones. This stage list is going to minimize those issues. It's going to introduce a little more variety while still leaving out stages like WarioWare or Frygate. First of all, we have to minimize the giant empty stages. Your PS2s, your Town and Cities, your Final Destinations, your Kaloses. We have 4 giant stages with a lot of space, and that is really over-centralizing. Town and City should not be in any stage list. It's a really fun stage. It's probably my favorite stage to play on because it gives you so much space while still having very close blast zones. However, Town and City can literally kill you. Stages that can kill you should not be legal. It certainly shouldn't be a starter, being one of the longest stages in the rule set with some of the smallest blast zones. It's just too polarizing, and the stage can kill you. Speaking of long stages with tiny blast zones, we should not be including PS2. First off, Pokemon Stadium 2 is amazing for top tiers. It's good for zoners because of the platforms and the long length. They can hide under platforms and make it hard to approach. The opponent has a further distance to close in while approaching. PS2 is the longest legal stage in the game, and it gives fast characters much more space to move around. They can take advantage of the space in a way many slower characters just can't. Not to mention, PS2 is exceptionally good for Steve. It gives him stone, which means he has stronger and more durable tools, which means he'll have a better advantage state. He also gets stone walls, which are more difficult to break and incentivize a more defensive neutral from Steve players. Stone is arguably the best material in terms of strength to mine time. Honestly, it's kind of crazy that PS2 has not only been considered a neutral stage, but the most neutral stage, when it's not. It's the longest legal stage with tiny blast zones. But we gentlemen there all the time. Clearly, Ultimate players cannot be trusted to act in their best interest. Action needs to be taken. More seriously, PS2 actually is a good stage. It's nice to have a long stage, and it's nice to have small blast zones, and the platform layout is good, but we can get all of those beneficial aspects of PS2 with other stages without over-centralizing the stage list with long stages and small blast zones. We can replace PS2 for a more varied stage list with more interesting stage choice. So, we're going to try to introduce more variety with the stages that we play with. This gives the player good, complex reasons to pick a stage. There will be pros and cons to every stage, and very few characters will have stages that are just flat out horrible for them with no benefit. While adjusting the stage list, I think it's also important to try to reduce the number of stages we play with. This is pretty important for accessibility. It's easier to remember the stage list with less stages to remember. This will result in sets running quicker and easier tournaments for TOs to run. Because of this, I'm going to be proposing a 6-stage list with DSR, similar to Melee. It's worked for them for 20 years, and while 6-stage lists aren't perfect, they are proven to be able to sustain a healthy meta, and there are real benefits to reducing the stage count. DSR does have its critics and its problems, however, I think it's the best option, both in terms of the experience for spectators and the experience as a competitor. You're going to have to play on some stages that you don't like, but you also get to play on some stages that you really do like. Competitors being given more interesting choices will lead to more skill expression and higher competitive integrity. Moving on, let's look at the time limit. I would like to propose a 6-minute time limit. That's roughly 2 minutes per stock. It's the same ratio for Melee, who have 4 stocks in 8 minutes, and with how much advantage states have developed, I think that's more than enough time. However, this would buff timeouts and incentivize them further. But people are already going for timeouts, and I wouldn't say it's more interactive, but a 6-minute timeout is less non-interactive than a 7-minute one. Plus, the Taunt Clause would still make non-interactive timeouts more difficult. So these non-interactive, boring timeouts will still be nerfed, but timeouts that just come from slow-paced play will take less time. And those timeouts that come from slow-paced play, rather than just not interacting with the opponent, can be beneficial both from a spectator and competitor's experience. With timeouts taking 6 minutes instead of 7, sets would take less time, which would mean that tournaments could run faster and easier for TOs. And we wouldn't be further incentivizing timeouts because the Taunt Clause is already in effect. Next up is character or stage first. Generally, I prefer stage first over character first. One reason is accessibility. Choosing a stage comes before choosing a character in the menus, so it just makes things easier, makes the tournament process easier, especially for new players. However, it's still not that difficult to choose your character before choosing the stage. Most people already know what character they're going to be playing before they look at the roster. Even so, it's still worth considering. The bigger reason I prefer stage first is it allows underused characters to have more relevance in the meta. For example, Lucario is not played very often and is generally considered pretty bad, mostly because of his lightweight, which means that he can't take advantage of aura. However, if you could pick a character after the stage is picked, anytime your opponent goes to Kalos, you could use a secondary Lucario. It would give him a place in the meta that he otherwise doesn't have. However, on the stage list that I'm proposing, I don't think stage first is the right way to go. On a small, varied stage list with best of 3 only having 1 ban and best of 5 having none, I'm worried being able to pick characters after stages might be a little too overpowered. Yeah, it would buff bad characters, but it would also buff good characters. And while I think bad characters generally see a larger improvement on their best stage than good characters on their best stage, the time investment to learn a new character would still buff good characters more in this meta. Why learn a low tier that you only play on one stage when you could learn a top tier that you play usually on only one stage, but you can also bring over to other stages and do very well? Plus, character first doesn't totally remove the ability to use bad characters on good stages. For example, a Zelda secondary would still be guaranteed a game with Zelda on Smashville if they get a counterpick in a best of 5 set. But they likely wouldn't be able to do so in a best of 3 where their opponent will almost definitely ban Smashville. And being able to go to Smashville for only one game weakens that option in a best of 5. Because even if you get to play a favored stage in one game, there's still 4 games left in that set. So to avoid going from a campy to just a corny meta, we should probably use character first. Okay, so that was a lot of things that weren't the stage list, so let's actually get to the stages. First off, we've got Midgar. The first thing you'll notice is the larger side blast zones. This allows characters to survive to higher percents, which means that characters do have the ability to use rage or something like aura. Now, most of the stage list is going to be focusing on incentivizing offense and early kills, but I think it is nice to have at least one option that rewards a good defense. Now, a lot of people look at Midgar and think it's basically just another battlefield. However, that's not true. The platforms of the stage are higher up and spread further apart than Battlefield. Platforms in this game are kind of a pain in the ass and tricky to get off of. They're really sticky, so the spacing of these platforms makes them less intrusive on gameplay, while still being there if you want access to them in neutral, advantage, or disadvantage. This platform layout makes camping under side plats less effective. Battlefield has a nasty trend of camping under the side platform while also having a very high top blast zone. This means that the stage becomes pretty defensive and non-interactive in a lot of matchups. However, since the platforms on Midgar are spread further apart and are higher above you, you can't just sit under them as easily. It's more difficult to camp on this stage. Midgar may be helpful for surviving to higher percents, but the difference in platforms incentivizes more interaction compared to Battlefield. Finally, this is going to be the longest stage on my list. It's a little longer than Town and City, but not as long as PS2, which means that fast characters get more space to move around, and zoners get more space to zone. Nothing is wrong with having that in a stage list, and it's actually good to have the option, but it's not good when it's the only option. This also helps even out the stage list. This means that there will be 1 large stage, 2 small, and 3 medium stages. The ratio of large to small stages is uneven, but the medium 180 unit stage size is already pretty large, so I think this justifies only having 1 larger stage. Something like Dreamland is my perfect stage length, but it just doesn't fit into this rule set. Midgar borrows traits from Battlefield, Town and City, and Kalos, making for a triplat stage with high survivability and lots of space to move around. Up next, we've got Small Battlefield. This is obviously a great stage. It's been a staple of basically every single rule set since it's come out. Its small blast zones and platforms incentivize aggression and strong advantage. With that being said, it is actually pretty neutral, but it rewards aggression a little bit more. Up next is Small Battlefield's brother, Hollow Bastion. It's pretty neutral, but incentivizes defensive play a little bit more. This is mostly because it's easier to control center stage by being under the center platform. This is partly because on Small Battlefield, you can extend your punish from one platform to the other, as well as the platforms on Small Battlefield being closer to the side blast zones. Up next, we've got Smashville. On a surface level, it seems very similar to Hollow Bastion, mostly because they have a similar platform layout. They both have a center platform, but Smashville's platform is just slightly higher, which means that pressuring platform is more difficult. However, the big difference between Hollow Bastion and Smashville is being a smaller stage. This means that slower characters have a better time closing in on the opponent because there's less space for them to gap. However, controlling center stage is more powerful than on Hollow Bastion because you have access to more of the stage. You can also get some interesting ledge and recovery mix-ups because the stage is so small and so thin that a lot of characters can go under it to the other ledge. Smashville also has a much higher top blast zone than most stages on this list. This high top blast zone combined with earlier kills from center stage creates an interesting stage where killing off the top is weaker, but killing off the side is much more consistent. So the stage size and blast zones of Smashville make it pretty distinct from Hollow Bastion. Up next, we've got Final Destination. It's FD, I don't need to explain it that much. It simplifies the game a bit, but gives the option to play without platforms getting in the way, which is nice on a game like Ultimate where the platforms are pretty shit. The lack of platforms can provide more freedom of movement in terms of not getting stuck on those platforms, and the lack of platforms can buff advantage states, particularly juggling, while nerfing disadvantage. The lack of platforms can also make neutral more interactive because there are no platforms to retreat to. You have to contest your opponent. A lot of people don't like FD because it can simplify the game. And if we were only playing on FD, I would agree, but having the choice to simplify things is still a choice. The choice to dumb things down has value and can create complexity itself. Finally, Yoshi's story. It used to be legal, now it is generally not, but I think we should bring it back. First of all, it's a small stage, and in Smash Ultimate, we don't have a lot of small stages. Most of our stages are kind of oversized. They're 180 units. We do have Smashville, but Smashville can also buff zoners a lot because getting control of center stage is really strong. But on Yoshi's story, we get a small stage that doesn't buff zoners. It's also a triplat, but it's much better suited for advantage states than Midgar. Midgar can still help advantage states, but the platforms are higher up and further apart, so it isn't as good for advantage as something like Yoshi's Story. Yoshi's Story also has pretty small blast zones, which means that you'll be getting earlier kills and a buffed advantage state. We also get walls off stage, and some people don't like stages with offstage walls because they buff recoveries too much, but they also buff edge guards. Offstage walls let you wall jump without burning your double jump, so that means you have much more freedom when it comes to edge guarding. Some characters can also hug the wall and tech to avoid low commitment edge guards like Villager Bowling Ball, but this also allows people edge guarding to avoid reversals. Yoshi's offstage walls open up new edge guards and recoveries, and while it wouldn't be great if every single stage had offstage walls, having one for that little option is nice to have. Finally, people don't like the slopes on Yoshi's, which is one of the main reasons why it was banned. However, the slopes on Yoshi's are much less intrusive than something like Lilat. Plus, they can open up new combos, new options in neutral, and some projectiles have some pretty interesting interactions with slopes, both in terms of being nerfed and buffed. Projectiles generally get nerfed by slopes, but there are some projectiles that actually get new options from slopes. So Yoshi's Story can give us some interesting benefits of slopes while still reducing their overall intrusiveness. Now that we've covered the stage list, let's look at the Steve problem. Should we ban Steve? I'm not really convinced that Steve rises to the level of justifying a ban, and many other people aren't. And it's also important to note that banning Steve would both harm Steve and non-Steve players. Steve players would lose their main, it's a character that they enjoy playing and a character that they put a lot of time into, and non-Steve players would lose another opponent. Steve has one of the most unique and creative movesets in the game, and despite the hate, many people actually enjoy watching Steve. Some people even enjoy fighting him. He has lots of intricate interactions to learn and lots of unique ways to use blocks against him. And even for people that don't enjoy Steve, there is still some competitive value in keeping unenjoyable characters legal. However, if Steve truly is bannable, wouldn't it be better to nerf him so we could still enjoy the positive aspects of the character rather than just outright barring his use in competitive play? One option for this is custom balance. It allows you to increase or decrease the knockback of characters by intervals of 10%. It's a mechanic intended to allow players to buff or nerf characters deemed too weak or too strong. Using custom balance, we can nerf Steve's knockback by 10%. This would mean that Steve's tools are less overtuned than they are currently, while still allowing him to use his creative and unique moveset. Sakurai gave us these tools, why not use them? Well, you can't use them online, which would mean that Steve would still be really broken in online tournaments, and you can't get accurate practice in the matchup online. And should we really be adjusting the knockback of a character? Should we really be opening that can of worms? It completely changes so many things for the mains of the character, and it also completely changes so many things for people that have learned the matchup. Not only that, but it opens up the possibility of nerfing other top tiers or buffing low tiers, which seems just too strong of a hand. So we should take a more subtle approach with the rules. First off, I originally proposed the Taunt Clause to stop Steve from camping and mining behind a wall. With the Taunt Clause, he becomes much less defensive and much more interactive. Not only that, but the stage list that I've created also significantly nerfs Steve. We'll look at them in order from his worst stages to his best stages. First up is Midgar. Midgar is long and has platforms to camp under, which Steve does like, but they're harder to camp under because they're further apart and higher up. Not only that, but Steve only mines iron on Midgar, which seems like it would actually be really good. However, it takes the longest to mine of any material. He'll have more consistent access to iron, but he'll take much longer to get any materials. Since the only resource he has access to on Midgar is iron, spawning a new crafting table, using minecart, using anvil, using throws, and crafting tools all use his only resource. If you're able to drain him of iron, which is easy because it takes so long to mine and he constantly uses it, he'll have nothing left. Moving on, Smashville. Smashville has a big platform to hide under, but he won't get much camping done because the stage is so small, meaning he will basically always be in the burst range of his opponent. This is pretty bad for Steve because the mid-range is where Steve struggles most to keep up in neutral. You'll constantly be able to apply pressure and threaten Steve. Steve also only mines wood on Smashville, which is weaker than stone. This means Steve's walls will be easier to break, making his defense in neutral weaker. He also doesn't have access to his stone tools, meaning Steve must either mine more for iron tools or craft more to fix his wooden tools. Both options aren't great as they open Steve up to being punished. Next up, we've got Yoshi's Story. Similar to Smashville, Steve struggles on small stages, and Yoshi's is no different. This means he'll have difficulty camping and staying out of your burst range. Steve also only mines wood and wool, which are the weakest materials Steve has access to. That means Steve's walls will be easier to break, and Yoshi's has slants, which aren't too intrusive for you, but they don't play very well with Steve's blocks. Moving on, we've got Small Battlefield and Final Destination. These stages aren't bad for Steve, but they aren't incredible for him, as they give him access to every material, which in some cases is good, but other cases you would really only want to have access to stone. The major differences between these stages are access to platforms and tools used to mine. On Final Destination, you dig with a shovel, which means you won't lose durability for any of your attacks from mining. However, you don't have platforms to camp under, which makes Steve's neutral weaker. On Small Battlefield, you have platforms to camp under, which is very strong for Steve, but you lose durability when you mine with your pickaxe, which means you could lose access to Fair and Bear. Overall, this is pretty minor, and it's probably the better stage of the two. Finally, we've got Hollow Bastion. Hollow Bastion is overall Steve's best stage, but there are some issues with it. It gives him a medium-sized stage and a platform to camp under, but he also has access to great materials on the stage. The center and ledges of the stage are made of stone, which allows Steve to quickly mine for strong stone walls and durable, slightly stronger stone tools. However, Steve can also mine on the copper middle ring of the stage for iron. This means Steve basically always has access to the choice between slowly mining for iron or quickly mining for stone, which is really strong. Although stone is strong, it still introduces a weakness. Mining stone is still slower than mining dirt or wood, which means getting resources is a bit riskier. Stone is also the lowest value resource Steve will use to make crafting tables on the stage, meaning destroying the crafting table on Hollow Bastion is more damaging than other stages. It takes very little wood or 1 iron to craft a crafting table, but with stone, it uses 4 blocks, which is a lot. By consistently destroying crafting table, you could starve Steve of his resources. And this, combined with the center platform not being optimal to camp under, means that I could see a future where Hollow Bastion actually becomes one of his worst stages, and Small Battlefield is his best stage on this list. Overall, I think this stage list heavily nerfed Steve. I didn't really balance it around Steve, but it just ended up giving Steve significantly less strong stages, including half the stage list being bad for the character. Combined with full DSR, the stage list significantly nerfed Steve. In conclusion, that's my rule set. I've tried to address a lot of issues in the current Ultimate meta, from lack of stage variety to non-interactive gameplay. And I think the adoption of this rule set will lead to a more accessible, more entertaining, and more competitive game.